So is anyone willing to give an opening prayer? I'm going to randomly call on someone. Sandra, okay.
Sarah.
All right, Sandra, would you can go ahead, please. Thank you.
Heavenly Father, this group of lovely ladies that are your daughters in Christ have come together to glorify your name in all we say and do and think. And we ask that you will watch over us, keep us safe, be with those that have health problems, and throughout the world, the problems that we see, we know the answer is Jesus, and we pray for his return. We ask that you will give us listening ears and open minds to hear what's being said today, and be with Julie as she gives this class. It's through Jesus' name that we pray and offer you thanks and praise. Amen.
Thank you. So as I said, I'm not feeling great, so I don't know how much moderation I'll be doing. But we heard from Sister Dana a couple months ago on kind of the traditional understanding of women's roles, and we talked about hearing another perspective, and Julie has offered to share that with us. So yeah, I hope we can all listen attentively and compare everything with scripture and reason together, which is such an important thing to be able to do. So Julie, take it away.
Okay. Jessica had asked me to talk about this very sensitive topic, the gender role discussion. I've been thinking long and hard how to present my faith journey on this topic, and I'm asking that comments be saved for our discussion time, which we'll have after this class, because I'm sure there'll be a lot to discuss. I'm a little bit nervous about it because I can remember being very nervous hearing some of the things for the first time that I'm about to talk about today. So it might be new for some people, for others it may not be. So, and I'm covering a lot of material in a short time. I don't have slides, so I would suggest that you have your Bibles handy, as well as a pencil and notebook to jot down the verses, questions, or whatever you have for comments at the end. My goal here is not to change anybody's mind, but to only get people thinking. My faith journey took a turn a couple of years ago. I was exposed to a conversation regarding women and head covering when I attended another ecclesia where women didn't wear head coverings. At first, I was very uncomfortable, like I said, as it was not my norm, and not what I was used to for the past 50 years. I decided to do some study, thinking, sorry, just a little bit congestion still, thinking I could prove without a doubt what I've been practicing. And to my surprise, I found it wasn't as clear as I thought. And there were things in the Bible I didn't notice before. Just like with my first journey, when I came into the community of Christadelphians from being a Catholic many years ago. I'm sharing with you what has been on my mind and why I have been rethinking the biblical position on women's roles, and to inspire people to revisit this topic on their own to see if what they think is really there. We should all do this for any topic. Trying to pick out and narrow down what to talk about today has been a challenge for me, so I am going to go in the order that I journeyed. I will give you resources like books and online classes that you can go to for more detailed study that I found helpful. But for the most part, for my study, I just kept reading and rereading pertinent scriptures that restricted sisters, and I kept reading them over and over again, trying to understand them. This is what I've come up with so far, with a little help from the things that I read. There are many ways to interpret the said scriptures that I didn't realize before. And that it's hard to be dogmatic with scriptures we use. In other words, these restrictive, that's a tongue twister, passages could be used as support passages if clear principles are in other parts of the Bible. but in and of themselves, they are not as clear and direct as I said that I once thought they were. Since I started this journey with the wearing of or not wearing of hats by women, I'll address that topic first in 1 Corinthians 11. I'd like to point out that in a book on this topic by Sister and Brother Averill and Ian McCaffey, they list 17 ways that these verses can be interpreted by Christadelphians over, or have been interpreted by Christadelphians over the years to support the symbolic representation of them starting from 1970 to 2019. And it's interesting that it started, the position started to be more articulated in 1970 when a lot of the other churches were making a more restrictive role of women, perhaps due to women's liberation at the time. What struck me about this is that they are all so different. If the main principle was clear, why would all these Christadelphian interpretations be so different? These interpretations include many things that are not in 1 Corinthians 11. For example, here is an excerpt from Ian and Averill's book that they quote from 1997. Head coverings are necessary for sisters, at least within the context of breaking bread, in order to portray the salvation of the bride of Christ. This is particularly appropriate within the memorial feast because this is a type of the marriage supper of the Lamb. And in this type, the brethren represent Christ, while the sisters represent the bride. Within this setting, their head coverings show that the bride has been saved from sin by her husband. Accordingly, brothers do not wear head coverings because Christ was sinless. Averill and Ian point out some assumptions that were made in this passage, and I'd like to present them to you now. Head coverings are necessary for sisters, is the quote. They say the passage does not say sisters in general, but any woman who prays and prophesies. The quote is that brethren represent Christ while sisters represent the bride. Where does the Bible teach this? The church consisting of brothers and sisters together are the body of Christ. And in Ephesians, husbands are told to care for their wives, following the example of how Christ cares for the church, his body. In this analogy, the church is described as the wife bride of Christ, but it's not divided up into two groups, one group representing Christ and the other the bride. Right. Quote, their head covering shows that the bride has been saved from sin by her husband. Okay, their comment, this follows on from the analogy represented in this paragraph. So it's presumably intended to mean that by wearing a head covering, sisters acknowledge the salvation of the church, the salvation the church has received from its Savior Christ. But is there any reason to suppose in 1 Corinthians 11 that this is what a covering meant? Accordingly, this is a quote, brethren do not wear a head covering because Christ is sinless. Likewise, and this is their comment, likewise, is there any reason to suppose for 1 Corinthians 11 that not wearing a head covering is a way of proclaiming that Christ is sinless? So those were the things that I had found interesting. And here are some of the additional thoughts I had from just reading it over and over again myself. And I should say, I did get a lot of support from the other books and writings. But again, reading these over and over yourself, you'll see some of these things on your own, I think. Maybe not. There are different ways to interpret 1 Corinthians 11, in my opinion, from reading. The traditional way is that women are to have their heads covered during memorial service to show their subjection to men. Some go as far as to say head coverings should be worn by women for all gatherings where there are men and women. And so I was seeing the inconsistencies myself. Mm-hmm. And here are some things that are not often talked in the mainstream community. So This is what I saw. For example, why do we insist on head coverings for women, but do not allow them to pray in our community, as it says in verse 5? But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonoreth the head. Verse 6 says, if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. In other words, if a woman does not cover her head, we take it as it's just a disgrace to have her head cut off or shaved. I mean, to me, that doesn't make sense. And since no longer it's a disgrace for a woman to have her head shaved, then this doesn't apply with the if and then statement, but that's math, so forget about that. Just the whole idea that it's no longer a disgrace for women to have their head shaved. In fact, many people who have cancer have people support them in solidarity with shaving their heads. In verse 7, it says, a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. Yet the priests were to have their heads covered in the Old Testament. Moses had his face veiled or covered. An alternative translation offered in the footnotes of the NIV says it could mean a man ought to have long hair. But there's a problem with this translation as well, because it contradicts the Nazirite vow that men took in the Bible. Also in Genesis 1, verse 26 and 27, it says that mankind, male and female, were made in God's own image, and they were to rule the earth together and not just man. And we'll look into that in a little bit later. Also, I just remembered what was bugging me. I forgot to put something in here and in the class. So I'm just going to mention it now as I'm looking at Moses' face being veiled or covered. It brings up the point that Jesus broke the veil when he broke the covering and the curtain was split, that he is our covering. I can't remember if I say that somewhere in this talk, so I'm going to say it now just in case I didn't say that. In verse 11 and 12, it says, never, excuse me, there's lemon and vinegar in my tea. So if I make some scrunchy faces, that's why. In verse 11 and 12, it says, that's apple cider vinegar, by the way. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman, but everything comes from God. These verses don't support a hierarchy between men and women that is represented by a head covering. Verse 13 answers how we should handle these passages. Judge for yourself. Is it proper for a woman, in verse 13, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? I think I missed something here. I must have missed it anyway. I'm not sure if that's in verse 13. Anyway, again, the idea that women are to pray is totally overlooked and by many religious communities. At least if the women are required to wear a head covering in a group setting, they should be able to pray, though mandating head coverings has its inconsistencies. That judge, I think I brought up later, I did a lot of copying and pasting for this. Verse 14 says, does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him? Nature does not teach that it's a disgrace for a man to have long hair. By nature, men can grow hair as long as women can. And many men have had long hair throughout history, including those with the Nazirite vow that I had mentioned earlier. With all this discussion of hair and the idea that at the time women were coming out of the worship of Diana and letting their hair hang loose, which at the time was an object of male lust, or they were letting men know that they were available. With all of this going on culturally, could Paul be talking about wearing hair up for a covering? Wearing hair down loose was especially a no for married women. They were to wear their hair up culturally. Statues at the time show this, and that at least some of the women did not cover their heads. Think about it. If Paul wanted women to wear coverings, why would he say in 1 Timothy 2, I also want some women to dress modestly with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes? Why would he say that if they were to cover up all of that with a veil? I think I was going to say, judge for yourselves earlier, that goes along with verse 16. If anyone wants to be contentious with it about this, we have no other practice, nor do any of the churches. But an alternative rendering of that is, if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no custom, nor do the churches of God. This verse could easily mean that there is no such practice of being contentious. And in conclusion, perhaps of this section, perhaps we are to judge for ourselves and not be contentious by forcing a particular interpretation of these difficult passages, and limit this set of scriptures that have inconsistencies whichever way we take them. And rather, these differences should inspire us to search scriptures for ourselves to see if these things are true and find ways to make sense of them. Another point is that my husband or any other man does not cover my sin. Christ does. And though it does say that women's head should be covered when we pray or prophesy, it doesn't say that she has to wear one otherwise. I guess I'm going on this topic a little bit more. Then I found out that our statement of faith doesn't discuss head coverings. What? Perhaps our forefathers understood that it was just a tradition. Another point that another point that the 1 Corinthians 11 passage does not say is all men are to be the head of all women. It's only referring to a husband and wife if we do take it that way. I have also since did a class on Ephesians where I learned a lot about what it means to mutually submit to one another in love, including marriage and ecclesial life. I also talk about mystery being related to the Gentiles being included in the body of Christ or the bride of Christ. I'm going to put in a link to this at the end. It's class 5 that talks about the husband and wife. Class 4 is about music, which also relates to mutual submission. But if you would want to look at that, you can. Now I want to go to consider in general regarding the meaning of head. The word head can mean source or beginning, like the head of a river. The head or source of every man is Christ. The head or source of the woman, it's singular, is the man. And the head of Christ is God. It's not put in the order that we usually see it. Another way of rendering this is that Christ is the origin of every man, and the origin of one woman, Eve, was the one man, Adam. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is the man independent of woman. For as a woman came from man, so also man is born of the woman, but everything comes from God. So another way of saying this is Eve came from Adam, but Christ is the head of every man who came from by the woman. So it's likely that Paul was setting the prevalent patriarchal position, I shouldn't put 3 P's together, of the society around them. He was setting them straight, that in Christ, there's no differentiation between male or female, just as he goes on to say that for slave or free or Gentile, there's no differentiation. It's interesting that we have changed with the times regarding slaves, and rightly so, but we have not changed with the times regarding women. So I want to talk a little bit more now. This is not, this is again, how I journeyed. And so it's kind of in random order. In Mark 10, when Jesus is responding to the mother of the sons of Zebedee and asking them to have them sit at the left or sit at the right, Jesus replies, "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his mother and father and be united to his wife, and the two will become flesh. So there are no longer, oh no, I'm sorry, that's not that one. That Sons of Zebedee comes later. This was in response to who are we married to in the kingdom. They are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." They are one, not two halves, where one rules over the other half. Now I'd like to talk about some notes about authority. There are two places in scripture where the word authority is connected with over, or which we could interpret as over women. It's in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 10. This is one of them. "It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the angels." At the minimum, this verse applies to married women having her own husband as her head. However, as we saw, it could mean the opposite and be taken that a woman has authority over her own head or her own thoughts or actions or behavior. And we'll talk a little bit about having control over your own, over sin. The second place is 1 Timothy 2 and 12. "I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet." The word for authority in this verse is authentio in 831 in the Strong's. It's a compound of the word autos, 846, which has several different meanings, including the idea of a baffling wind or backwards, which is interesting because we're going to see that this section could be talking about women who were being gossipers and going back and forth to different houses and creating a ruckus. And the word hentis, which is an obscure word meaning to act of oneself. The Strong's Concordance concludes that it means to dominate strongly. This word is not used anywhere else in the Bible, so it's not the same word as used in 1 Corinthians 11. In fact, you usually have to go to Greek writings at the time to really know what this word means. Before I go into this verse in more depth, I want to point out that just because it says that women should not have authority, this is the same idea with the hats, just because it says that women should not have authority, or in this case, domineer over men, does not mean that men should rule or domineer over women. Nor does it say anywhere that a woman, by the way, should obey a man. That's not a phrase in scripture. There is only one other place where authority relates women, and this is in marriage where it relates to men as well. And that's in 1 Corinthians 7, verse 4. "The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but he yields it to his wife." This is a mutual authority where they're yielding to one another, their bodies, because the two have become one. This verse is often overlooked by those who believe that a man has authority over a woman, but not the other way. And it was by myself. And why is that? There are a few points to consider, other points to consider about 1 Timothy 2. Why do we put so much emphasis? I am having some tongue-tied problems this morning. Why do we put so much emphasis on these verses, on this verse, and yet ignore the earlier verse in the same chapter where it says, therefore, I want men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing. I don't see that happening in our ecclesial settings. The next text in 1 Timothy is clear from the first chapter what the problem was being addressed in this letter. So I'm going to go back to 1 Timothy 1, verse 3 through 7, and read a couple of highlights. I urged you when I went to Macedonia to stay there in Ephesus so that you may command certain people not to teach false doctrines any longer, or to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies. By the way, this is what the women were doing, going from door to door and promoting endless myths and genealogies. Such things provoke controversial speculations. The goal of this command is love, which comes from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. Some have departed from these and have turned to meaningless talk. They want to be teachers of the law. So this is a point. They wanted to be, these are people, he's talking in Timothy about people who wanted to be teachers of the law, but they don't know what they're talking about. Again, in 1 Timothy 3, verse 1, it says, here's a trustworthy saying, whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task. So certain people in this book were being addressed. And in verse 19 and 20 of chapter 1, if we go back, a couple of these certain people were Hymenaeus and Alexander. They were delivered to Satan by Paul. So they were already put out of the congregation for their shipwreck of faith. Now back to 1 Timothy 2, verse 1 through 4, we see that it says, they're talking about kings and those in authority. So those who we are supposed to have let be authority over us are the kings and those in authority. But that's what we're supposed to do because God has control over those. But he says that we have to do that because so that we may live a peaceful and quiet life in godliness and holiness. This is good and pleases God our Savior, who wants all people to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. Quiet here means still, which goes along with peaceful. The word quiet sometimes is translated silent. And in 1 Timothy 2, verse 11 and 12, the silent there means the same thing, to be still, not agitated, or in some cases, not provocative, trying to overpower men in a particular way, as was the custom of some women who were coming from the worship of Diana. I don't have time to go into this in detail in this class, but it's worth looking into. And in some of the resources I put later, you can check this out. The main point is that certain women who wanted to be teachers without the proper knowledge to teach were the ones who were to be still and learn more themselves. It's more likely that these women were widows and busybodies, as I said, talked about in 1 Timothy 5, verse 11. These verses were not meant to silence all women for all times, is what I've come now to the conclusion. These verses go on to mention Adam and Eve. In Adam, all men die. It doesn't say in Eve, all men die. In Adam, all men die. In Eve, whose name means the mother of all living, and who, yes, was deceived and a transgressor, in Eve comes life through her seed, Jesus Christ, in which she will be saved, and not only her, but all women and all of mankind who believe in her seed. Let's look at the curse for a minute in Genesis 3. It's interesting that God says to the serpent, because you have done this, cursed are you. Then he says, and are you above all livestock? Then he says to the man, cursed is the ground because of you. But he doesn't say to the woman, because of you. Instead, he says, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe with painful labor. You will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. This is what we use sometimes to go back to with some of the support verses I've been mentioning. But none of these outcomes in this section in Genesis 3 were the way things started out in creation. The earth was not supposed to, oh, here comes another tongue twister. The earth was not supposed to bring forth thorns and thistles. Of Eve, it says that your husband will rule, another one, your husband will rule over you. Not that it was good or that he should rule over you. It was not a good thing, just like the thistles were not good. The intention was from the beginning that man and woman would together as one rule over the earth. And we read this earlier in chapter 1, verse 27, that God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of this in the sea and birds in the air and every living creature that moves on the ground. He said to them. They were both created in God's image, and they were both to subdue the earth and rule over the animals. They were to be at one with each other and with God. There was peace in that. And that peace was broken by both of them when they ate the fruit. In Ephesians, it talks about returning to that peace through Jesus, Eve's promised seed. When we are baptized in Christ, we return to the pre-fall state, not to the state of the curse. Let's now look at the only other place where it says that women should be silent, and that's in 1 Corinthians 14, verse 34 and 35. Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak. We're all familiar with these verses, but must be in submission as the law says. If they want to inquire something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it's disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. Okay, so for one thing, these verses don't seem to fit the rest of the chapter, nor the previous chapters. We don't have time to look at them in depth, but women were to pray and prophesy. Just a few verses before, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 14 and 26, what then shall we say, brothers and sisters? When you come together, each of you has a hymn or a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Everything must be done so the church may be built up. And in the first verse, it says in that chapter, follow the way of love and eagerly desire the gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. He's talking to all the brothers and sisters. Paul concludes with the chapter, or concludes the chapter with, therefore, my brothers and sisters, be eager to prophesy and don't forbid speaking in tongues, but everything should be done in a fit and orderly way. This includes women. So verses 34 and 35 cannot mean for all women at all times to be silent. Looking at verse 27 and 28 of that chapter, it says, if anyone speaks in a tongue, 2 or more at the most, 3 should speak, one at a time, and someone must interpret. If there is no interpreter, the speaker should keep silent in the church or keep quiet in the church and speak to himself and to God. So even men had to at times keep silent. Paul wouldn't say to go home and ask your wife questions, because that wasn't the protocol at that time. The whole chapter is mainly talking about restricting disorderly conduct. So it's more likely that verse 34 and verse 35 were referring to women who were disorderly, the same way as in Timothy. There are also various reasons why these verses here are here if they don't fit in, including the possibility that Paul was quoting from the Roman laws about women. His words are almost a direct quote from a speech given by one consul, Cato the Elder, who made his speech probably during the reign of Caesar Augustus around 30 BC or between that and 17 AD. As captured by this historian called Livy, and again, the resources I put below, or I put at the end here, you'll be able to reference this. Paul responds after these two verses, what? After his words are almost exactly what it says in this speech, what? As he typically does with his writing style, he does put in things here and there and say, what? Like, this doesn't make sense. But regardless of why it's there or where it comes from, we often neglect to consider that there's no place in the Hebrew law that silences women. That was interesting, I thought. Though women's words were not significantly represented in history because men ruled over them, there were women who had voices and were not rebuked or silenced. I'll list some of these later. I'd like to take a few moments to look, well, maybe just a few more than a few moments, to look at the word rule. I just looked at these myself, looking them up in the concordance. If Genesis 4 verse 7, it says to Cain, if you do what's right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what's right, sin is crouching at your door. Its desire to have you. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. We are supposed to rule over sin, not another person. No person is to rule over us, but God and his son. Ruth 1:1 says, and I'm only going to read this line, in the days when the judges ruled. Deborah was a judge and therefore a ruler. She was also a prophetess and a warrior. You can see this in Judges 4. In 1 Samuel 12:12, this is talking about when Samuel was approached by the people, and he says to them, you said to me, no, we want a king to rule over us. And he says, even though the Lord your God was your king. The people wanted a king like the people around them, even though God was their king. And this didn't work out well for them when they got a king. In Judges chapter 8 and 22 and 23, it says, the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule thou over us. But Gideon says, I will not rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. In Isaiah 29, verse 13, it's a verse that Jesus quotes. It says, these people come near me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship of me is based merely on human rules they have been taught. I thought that was interesting. In Isaiah 60, it says in verse 17, I will make peace your governor and well-being your ruler. So our peaceful state is what we should rule us and our well-being. In Luke 22, verse 26, it says, where Jesus was, well, I forget actually the context of this particular verse. It could be when the washing of the feet, but I think I bring that up later. The greatest, Jesus says, the greatest among you should be the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves. We are not to rule over one another, but to submit to one another. That's the main point in Ephesians, where it says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. This verse is another one that's typically overlooked when looking at the next set of verses. In Ephesians 5, verse 22 and on is when it talks about submission of the women. The word submit is understood to mean, from the Strong's, to put under or to put oneself under. In other words, to treat others more important than yourself. There are different examples of this word hupotasso being used in scripture. One is in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 15 and 16. It was talking about the household of Stephanus that were first converts, and it talks about the service of the people who were devoted. And then it says, I urge you, brothers and sisters, to submit to such people and to everyone who joins in the work and labors at it. This is an example where brothers and sisters were to submit to other brothers and sisters who join in the work. The vast majority of the word submit in the Bible is actually put together with yourself. Submit yourself. That is something that must be done willingly and in the right spirit. God doesn't say make others submit to you. Rather, he requests people to submit to others. And then he juxtaposes this with love and service in the Ephesians. And again, I go into this in more detail in my class that I mentioned earlier. But for right now, for example, the elders must feed the flock, not by lording it over them, but by examples. In 1 Peter 5, in 1 through 3, it says, so I exhort the elders among you to tend the flocks of God that are in your charge, not by constraint, but willingly, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not as domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. So if they were leaders, they were to be examples. And Jesus says, after he washed the disciples' feet, you call me teachers and Lord, and rightly, you call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so. For that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I've done for you. In Ephesians, it also talks about Christ is our Lord, and in him and through him, we may approach God with freedom and confidence. There's no idea of rulership or over from someone else there. And in Ephesians 6, verse 12, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers and authorities and against the powers of this dark world. And in Colossians 3, verse 16, it says, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body, you are called again to peace. And peace actually means to be reunited back to the pre-fall state. That's what I think it is. Another side note is the word role is not in the Bible, and it doesn't say anywhere in scripture. I already mentioned that it is, that maybe I just thought it was worth repeating, that a woman is to obey a man, or that he is to have authority over her. There were women who had authority. And in Esther 9, verse 29, it says, Queen Esther, along with Mordecai, wrote with full authority. And Deborah, as we spoke about earlier, was a ruler. Women, the point is that no person in Christ has authority over any other believer, male or female. slave or free, Jew or Gentile, but all are to be servants or slaves to each other. If at minimum, the husband is the head of the wife, he does it with love and service to her. I quoted again, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. I just missed that verse, but it's just pretty much saying the same thing. Women who are silent in the Bible are, excuse me, Sarah, Rebecca, Miriam, the daughters of Zelophehad. By the way, the daughters of Zelophehad approached Moses and Aaron and all the high priests and a group of men, and their voice regarding their inheritance was heard and the law was changed. Deborah, as we mentioned, Jael, who actually put a stake through Sisera, which could represent sin being nailed to the ground. Hannah and Mary's words were recorded, including how God will raise up the oppressed. They're included in scripture. Not here is a link. I will put in a link to some talks by John Popel, in which he talks about some of the women that are a type of Christ. They're really good talks, and I think he's writing a book on that topic. Look at Romans 16 on your own. About a third of the people listed here are women. I commend you, sisters, Sister Phoebe, a deacon. By the way, deacon is I believe the same word for male or female of the church. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way that's worthy. Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ. They risked their lives for me. Greet Mary, who worked very hard for you. I don't think he meant cooking and cleaning. Greet Adronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews who have been in prison with me. They were outstanding among the apostles. It says Junia was outstanding apostles. Was an outstanding apostle. Why would a woman be in prison if she was not speaking and preaching? Greet Tryphenia and Tryphosa, those women who work hard in the Lord. And in Philippians 4 verse 2, it says, Euodia and Syntyche were active workers at Paul's side. My husband showed me a book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood by Beth Allison Barr. In it, she uses the expression household codes that came from Ephesians 5, Colossians 3, 1 Peter 2, Titus 2. She asks the question, what if we have it wrong? What if we are following other churches who use these codes to restrict women when Paul's message was actually the opposite? She quotes a 12th century scholastic, Peter Abelard, who discusses the woman who anointed Christ with oil. That's in Matthew 26. He says, when a woman and not a man is linked with Christ's headship, she indeed institutes him as Christ or the anointed. Barr goes on to say, by allowing a woman to anoint him with oil, Jesus overturns male headship, allowing a woman to do what only men have been able to do until that moment, anoint a king. Continuing some of her words, historical context suggests that wifely submission was not to the point of Paul's writings, including the household codes. Rather than including the codes to dictate how Christians should follow the gender hierarchy of the Roman Empire around them, what if Paul is teaching Christians to live differently? Rather than a text of terror for women, what if they are read as a resistance narratives to Roman patriarchy? Male guardianship was a Roman law. Wives legally had to submit to the authority of their husbands married women had to submit to the authority of their husbands. Unmarried women had to submit to the authority of their fathers or nearest male relatives. Women could not own property or run businesses in their own right. Women could not conduct legal or financial transactions without a man acting on their behalf. From this historical perspective, it's not surprising to find the discussions about wives in the first century text. Paul's inclusions of the statement for women to be subject to their husbands is exactly what the Romans world would have expected. So what's interesting to me is that if it was already the Roman structure about women, children, and slaves, that how they illegally had to submit, why would Paul restate the obvious unless he had something different to say? Barr says Paul wasn't telling the early Christian church to look like everyone else. He was telling them that as Christians, they needed to be different. Rachel Held Evans explains the Christian household codes as a Jesus remix of Roman patriarchy. Scholarship suggests that the term remix provides a good description. When rightly read, the household codes do not only set women free, they set all the members of the households free from the oppressive elements of the Roman world. Paul wasn't imposing Roman patriarchy on Christians. Paul was using I believe now, a remix to tell Christians how the Gospels set them free. The emphasis in Paul's writings is not that men have power to rule, it's that they had a responsibility. The words prior to this, by the way, were Barr's words. Now this goes back to my words. Or what I'm presenting today. The emphasis in Paul's writings is not that men have power to rule. It was that they had a responsibility to love and not mistreat those in their households, including women, children, and slaves. Those who were owned had a responsibility to submit willingly. Women and slaves are now no longer owned. So in our world, this doesn't apply in the same way. What Paul was saying is that Christ is the head of the household and leads with example of love and service. There are other verses in the Bible that don't apply to us. One of them is drinking wine for the stomach's sake, which specifically applied to Timothy, greeting one another with a holy kiss, or as I said, raising hands, holy hands in prayer. And we don't greet each other with psalms and songs and hymns in the way they did. Maybe we should do some of these things. It's not necessary for us to shake off dust off our feet. Some of these verses are particularly meant for the people that were written to, like in 2 Timothy 4, where Paul asked Timothy to bring him the parchment papers. And the use of demons, which was prevalent in the time, was not dismissed at the time. We have no problem with putting those verses in context. So now I'm winding this up. I've been asked by some, what is the big deal? Why can't you just wear a hat and keep silent and not upset the community? I want to say, I'm not trying to upset anyone. And I'm not trying to force these views on anyone. I believe people should use their own consciences on this subject. But I am concerned when it comes to silencing half of our community, which is based only on 3 or 4 verses, because we prevent a necessary balance that we need in our ecclesia to stand firm. And not only that, I know personally of a few sisters who've been mistreated by our ecclesias and encouraged to stay with abusive or cheating husbands because of our position that women should be in subjection to men. And so I'm putting some thoughts out to ponder today. I believe we are also risking our young people who cannot see us silencing women when women are not silenced in schools or in the workplace. And we are dissuading potential believers to have the freedom and salvation in Christ. If we may be wrong in our traditional way of thinking, isn't it worth taking time, our time, to revisit our position? There's so much more I could say, but I have to leave time for discussion. I want to leave time for discussion. I'll put some resources in the chat box that are worth looking at for those who want more information. But to recap, we looked at 1 Corinthians 11 and saw that inconsistencies in our community, or saw the inconsistencies in our community in our interpretation. We've seen evidence that the verses do not clearly spell out that men should rule over or have special authority over women, or any more than a woman should have over man, but rather we should all submit to one another in love. The body is not split, but rather one. Regarding head covering, men had their head covered in the Old Testament, and it's not clear that women should wear a head covering at all times and why they should, and there's no other support for it. It is not a shame for women to wear short hair now, so is a covering necessary, especially since we are all covered by Christ in the same way? We saw in 1 Timothy 2 that it's very likely that Paul was addressing certain women to be still, women that were unruly, who did not know enough to rule and yet wanted to. We saw in 1 Corinthians 14 that Paul could not have meant that all women should be silent in the congregation, because women were encouraged to prophesy, share a hymn, or a word of instruction, or a revelation, or a tongue or interpretation, just as men were. We listed many examples of women who are not silent. We also saw that the setting in which the household codes were given could very likely be to restrict the Roman laws and give freedom in the ecclesia to those who are owned and oppressed, and encourage the owners not to treat wives, children, and slaves harshly, but rather submit to them also in love. We saw that none of us are rulers over each other, but rather servants. What we do have to rule over is sin in ourselves. Christ, for all of us, men and women, is our head, our example of love and service, and our salvation.
Thank you, Julie. Anyone have any questions or comments? Let's try to make sure. I know there's probably a lot of questions and comments, and so let's just make sure to talk one at a time and be careful not to talk over anyone. And you're all muted. Most of you are muted, so you'll have to unmute if you want to talk.
Julie, I like the point you were trying to make, that Adam and Eve were in the garden for a very long time. According to the Jewish calendar, they were in the garden for 244 years. Wow. And they were naked and in the presence of God continually, and in the presence of angels, naked. So no head covering. So I really liked how you sort of tried to make that point.
I didn't know that. Thanks for sharing that. By the way, I'm just going to drop into the chat box right now the resources. I hope they all get in there. And maybe, Jessica, you can mail these out to people too if they wanted them. You can copy and paste them and put them into your email draft, and then you can have it for yourself right now. Thank you, Sandra.
And the other thing, it always puzzled me that if the head cover was so important, why Jesus never mentioned it in 4 Gospels.
That's right. That's a really good point.
It's not even mentioned.
That goes along with the idea that these are support verses if it was clear in other parts of Scripture.
It could also be that they normally did it, so he didn't address it. And I think that maybe Paul was addressing the fact that some women were given the Holy Spirit gifts, and that's why they had that special dispensation, sort of like Deborah as a prophetess, so that they could pray and prophesy in the first century church, which would not be the same as what we have now. I also might point out that Moses did wear a veil only to take away from showing the glory of God when it was fading. He did not wear a veil in the presence of God. So if you look at Exodus 34, that it explicitly
Yeah,
says,
I know he did. When he came down from the mountain, he covered himself because of his face was so
right,
white.
but when he was in the presence of God, so I think that's why the New Testament says in the presence of God, men don't wear a covering and women do. In the presence of God, Moses did not wear a veil.
Okay, would you mind putting in the text or in the chat box where it says
Sure.
that a man
Yeah.
should wear a covering a woman should wear a covering in the presence of God?
Well, if First Corinthians is talking about that, that's the headship thing. But I'm
Yeah,
saying,
but if I thought you said that it says that right there, does it? Because I might have missed it, but if it does, I'd be happy to see that in the chat box.
there is a principle of that, like when a woman was, what was it, when she was being accused of adultery, she took the veil off and would need to have her head shaved. So a shaven head is got to do with shame. And also in Ezekiel, it talks about the women that God's going to take off their veils because they're women that he is condemning in Ezekiel 13. So
Yeah, those verses, I looked those up. Most of those verses that talk about veil in that sense had to do with sin. But the veil that and wicked behavior, but the veil covering at that time was not to cover sin. There's no indication that it was to cover sin. It was more of a covering at that time. It was more of a covering of discriminating between who's married, who's not married, who's available, who's not available. I think that's more what the case was. And nonetheless, it can't clearly be shown that that's what it's referring to in 1 Corinthians 11. They're totally unrelated in terms of service to Christ.
unless it's honoring a principle of showing God glory and submission and headship, sort of like when Rebecca put on a veil when she first was going to meet Isaac. So I think there are these principles, but yeah, we don't have to go deeply into it. The other thing I was thinking about was that head does mean head, and it also, just in the concordance, it means anything supreme, chief, and prominent. So there is, in my mind, when I just look at the meaning of head in Greek, there is a level of preeminence there. So God, Jesus is,
Our head, yes,
he is
definitely.
a lot more authority and preeminence, and he is supreme. And so that whole lineage of God, Christ, man, woman, and then the idea of women submitting is much more spoken of in the New Testament than just mutual submission. So it is spoken that women should submit. So there is that whole concept.
Yeah, there is a couple places where it says that. And I talked about that in my Ephesians class, because when he talks about submission of women, women were now having freedom in Christ. And so perhaps they didn't think they had to submit to their husbands anymore, but legally they still had to submit. So I think that's why it was brought out more clearly. And men who didn't have to marry for love. In fact, often marriage was a transaction for business or for property, or men didn't marry necessarily for love. In fact, some men who had multiple wives married some wives for their inheritance and some wives for whatever else, or some of them they might have loved, but men were not marrying women just to love. So it does say to men more often that they should show love because they were perhaps ruling harshly. So there was an imbalance there, but the whole point is we are to mutually submit to one another, is the point that I was trying to bring out.
I find it interesting that Tamar wanted to look like a prostitute, so she put a veil on before she went to Judah.
That's
And
interesting.
yeah, I'm not
she took it off.
interested in looking at prostitutes, right?
Yeah. She took it off when she went back.
Mhm.
That's a really good point too, Sandra. Thank you.
Or maybe she didn't.
Actually, I thought that she
Sorry,
just put
Dana?
it on so that she wouldn't be recognized by her father-in-law.
Right.
That's what I always read.
I said it
It
could.
says, it says in the text that she wanted to look like a prostitute. It actually says that in the text.
So we'll have to go back and take a look at that. Thanks. Ethel, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I had
And
a
you're pretty
couple of
purple.
chains, and one of them is to do with Christadelphian practice, and the other one has to do with archaeology and word study. If I can mention them both and then get it over with. Sandra and Linda were both at West Avenue when my mother used to wear her fabulous hats. Remember those hats? They were great. And you had to wear a hat because I was quite rebellious. And after my time with Operation Onesimus, we decided that veils would be okay. So I wore this veil one day to meeting. And of course it was pink, wouldn't you know, because it went with my pink dress. But at any rate, I got approached by a brother who was very offended and told me that a veil was absolutely not acceptable because it was Catholic. And in fact, that's where
Catholic
people all
Church.
bought their veils at the time. So I kind of, you know, since I had to be submissive, I didn't argue. I thought, well, you know, fine. I would just wear a hat. Further along, I mean, there's a whole history of this with me, I guess, but more recently, I belong to a meeting where there are very strong feelings about the traditional approach. And in discussion one time, I found it quite amusing. I don't say anything. Anyway, apparently one of our members at his meeting in another country, one of the sisters had forgotten her hat, but they just happened to have some diapers. They used a diaper. Like, we're supposed to do things decently and in order. I'm sorry, I just sort of find it, I just like, what is this? Are we saved by our head covering? Anyway, that's my first story. Also the fact that Robert Roberts himself said that the wearing of, I can't remember if it was head coverings or hats, was up to the ecclesia. So that's all we have in Christadelphian literature of the pioneers. So anyway, that's part one. Part two is totally different. Part two is that I really agree with you that the archaeology and the actual what did the words really mean are fundamental. And if you have a word that's only ever used once in scripture, be careful. And also the context, like I can find this link, I guess, but there was a video that my husband and I were you know, found very, very interesting about the Timothy passage. And Timothy being written from Ephesus, you mentioned Diana. Well, the big temple to Artemis was in Ephesus. So this particular PhD student had investigated literature of the time that might relate to Timothy. And a couple of things that come out. One is that word authority can mean authorship. And the Diana cult, in the Diana cult, human beings came from the woman. And he's trying to, no, it comes from, human beings started with Adam, right? So from the man. So that came out of that study of the literature. And the other thing, which I guess is meaningful to me, I don't know how many other people here have no children, but I might as well resign if I'm saved by childbearing, right? Because I can't. Like I'm too old now, and I got married very late in life, so it's just not happened. Well, so that doesn't make sense at all. I know there are other ways of looking at that passage, but going to the archaeology and the background of it, the goddess of childbearing was also Artemis. So people still felt that they had to go to Artemis to be saved in childbearing, because we all know it's a really dangerous process. A lot of women die in childbirth. So people went, you know, they were saying, look, you don't need to go to Artemis. You know, you can be saved. You don't have to be saved by Artemis for childbearing, and that you can be saved. I can't remember the passage. It's not right in front of me, but I'm sure I've not done justice to this particular you know, investigation. But I think basically the point being there's a lot that we just don't know. and the context of the time were just not there. And modern scholarship is bringing some of these things out. And like 100 years ago, this scholarship did not, it hadn't happened yet. So all that being said, I don't say much in our ecclesia. I think I really want to contribute in positive ways, and I know it would upset people to bring all of these issues up. But I'm not wearing a diaper on my head. Sorry.
Yeah.
That's it.
Well, if any of you are planning to go to Manitoulin this summer, there would be absolutely no way you could go there without wearing a head covering the whole week in the classes. Because I've already been told I cannot go unless I wear a head cover.
Well, see, we have members of our meeting, majority, that's where they go for their Bible schools. So, I can live with that, but I just.
And people have a choice. I don't object to people who feel very strongly about it. I've felt very strongly about it for many years. And if that's, where you want to be and you think it's right, and if that's your conscience, people should be allowed to where people should be able to wear a hat. I'm not trying to say don't wear hats when I give this talk. I'm just trying to point out that there is another perspective, one that might be important to consider because of how we are mostly because of our young people and converts, but also for the way we treat women within our ecclesias and what that can lead to. But regarding your point about people or about archaeology, I can't remember. I just put in this morning, so I don't remember if I said it or not. But when they found these archaeologies, these busts of women, they didn't have head coverings and they had their hair up. And I mention that if Paul said you shouldn't have your hair adorned with jewels or whatever it says, now I can't remember exactly because my mind's going blank. But if you were not
braided hair.
Pardon? Braided hair, right. Braided hair, which by the way, usually meant people who, women who had wealth. And if you go into this a little bit more, these were wealthy women, more than likely, who were showing off their wealth in their, what they wore. And they were going from town to town, trying to have a position, in the ecclesia as being important. But anyway, why, if we wore head coverings, you would cover that up? What difference would it make?
On the subject of men wearing head coverings.
That's talking about, he's just talking in general about modesty. I think you're connecting to the memorial service.
Well, I am connecting it because in the context of that book, as I pointed out, he's talking about a lot about women that are widows or women who are, wanted to teach. That's why I'm bringing it up. And it really doesn't talk about in that particular section. It's not a memorial service in that particular section of scripture. I don't mean to. That's
what I'm saying, that he's talking there about, in general, women should dress modestly, but that's not meaning that they're wearing a veil when they're cooking dinner. But it's a different subject when they're approaching God's presence.
That could be, but you just don't know that for sure, is what I'm saying.
Well, just like in our culture, we shouldn't be dressing immodestly day to day. It's not just when we go on Sunday kind of thing. And I agree.
Either place. We shouldn't in either place. We shouldn't be spending money on all of that in either the ecclesia or the ecclesial setting or at home. We should be modest in what we spend. Is that what you're talking about, Dana?
No, I'm just saying that if he's talking that you shouldn't braid hair and have costly ornament in general in life, that doesn't, that your head is covered and you're wearing that to the meeting and it's not seen anyway, because that might be two completely different things he's talking about. One, in general, women should dress modestly and not, flamboyantly or showing off their wealth. But in 1 Corinthians 11, it could be that he's talking about in the memorial service, you acknowledge headship and you honor one another and you honor God, kind of thing.
Okay, I have a question for that. If you think that Timothy 2 may not be, which I don't think it is, the ecclesial setting, why do we use it to keep women silent in the ecclesial setting?
That's not the same, well, we'd have to
Same
look.
passage. Same section. There's another one in First Peter about let yours not be the outward adorning, but the one I'm talking about is right in the same section of First Timothy 2.
Yeah, I think Julie's point is that we assume that First Timothy 2 is talking about an ecclesial setting, but it doesn't actually say that in the text. So thanks for your talk, Julie. There was lots of information in that, and I come from a very traditional background, conservative background in northwest England. And I have been on a similar journey. And I started my journey the very same place as you in 1 Corinthians 11. I can remember when I was 18 or 19, I was on a youth holiday in Germany. And I was on a train, and there was a Dutch brother there, and we were discussing 1 Corinthians 11. And he said to me, well, why do our sisters wear head coverings? Because sisters in our churches keep silent. They do not pray and they do not prophesy. And even if those are spirit gifts, well, most Christadelphians would say spirit gifts are not available today. So the point still stands that women praying and prophesying in our ecclesias actually doesn't happen. And I remember him saying this, and it made me cry, because what I'd done was I had put words into the text. I had, in my mind, I had read, when a woman listens to a man prophesying or listens to a man praying, she should have her head covered. And it was only when he asked these questions that I thought, I've been reading a lot into that passage that actually isn't there. That was when I was 18. I think it took another 30 years before I did anything about it. Actually, I'm probably making out I'm older than I am. But yeah, it took, I guess in our community, if you don't like confrontation, and I don't like confrontation, I just sooner keep my head down. But when we are losing members and not attracting our young people, if these barriers are literally man-made barriers, we need to go back and look at them. But look at what God is wanting, I guess. That's the key, isn't it? We've all got different agendas, but look at what God is wanting. But yeah, same starting point with 1 Corinthians 11. And then the next point was 1 Corinthians 14. I'd always read the authorized version, so I always thought 1 Corinthians 14 was just, when it says brothers, it's just talking to men. So when it says brothers, be eager to pray and prophesy, I'm just thinking, well, that's obviously just talking to men. But actually, Adelphoi, as Christadelphian should know, means men and women. It's always in the masculine, but it means men and women. And then I'm thinking, well, you can't really cherry pick when you think it means just men or both. You've got to try and be fair with this. So I think that's what started me with 1 Corinthians 14 as well, that I do think that Paul is saying there, men and women be eager to prophesy, and that's exactly what was happening in 1 Corinthians 11. So we could Twitter on about this for ages, and it really does take years to get into what is going on, but I do think it is important to do that, because at the end of the day we need to be obedient to God, and we just got to try and work that out for ourselves. But on this, I think, accept the views of others as well. And it's not in our statement of faith, as you said, and just show some love and tolerance if we can. I pray we can. Thank you, Julie.
Thanks, Sarah. I know it is, I think, important to at least, if you still believe this after researching it, to know exactly what it's saying in today's terms, so that you can support what you think about wearing a head covering as well. So you don't have to look at it just to think, oh, I'm going to be knocked off my socks here. Maybe you won't be. And if you're not, that's great. We need to hear from you as to why not and how to address some of these other issues. The point that, by the way, I just thought of something that Ethel was talking about with the diaper on the head, or the, I've seen people use Kleenexes or pieces of paper towel or whatever. And some, we have little coverings that count. We have headbands that count. We have some of which, wrap their head all around. We've had, and in Ian and Avril's book, they point out, they have some pictures of times where hats were so elaborate that they brought attention to women, and they were wearing them, like your Sunday hat, or your Easter hat, or so this has been interpreted quite differently over the years, and it is, I think, something worth looking at in more depth for everyone if they want to.
Sue has her hand up. Oh, and now Hannah has her hand up. Sue, then Hannah.
I was just going to say something that I think most of us are probably aware of. When our community was formed, it was Victorian times, and it was pretty typical for women not to have any role whatsoever in the family. Children, or the daughters, generally weren't educated. It was only the boys that went to school for any length of time. Women certainly didn't go to any higher education if they were lucky to be able to read, but all of the things they were taught were household things, that they could run their household. There were arts and crafts and things like that. So women didn't have the opportunity when our community was formed to be leaders, to be teachers, to do anything other than maybe be able to understand scriptures. And we have not kept up with reality in that women, how many of our children don't go to high school? All of our children go to high school. All of our young women are thinking, intelligent people that 150, 200 years ago, they wouldn't have had that opportunity. And I think 2/3 of our problem is that we still, a lot of brothers and a lot of people in the community still subscribe to that Victorian way of thinking. That's one of my thoughts. And the other thought is, Sarah, you were saying how you kind of made it sound like you were the only one that connected or put 1 Timothy 2 and I think Corinthians together. I think as a community we've done that women should be covered and women should be silent, but they're two separate verses, they're two separate episodes. I pointed this out just this week. I don't know how many of you are on Facebook and are on uplifting Christadelphian discussions. Someone posted something that it was on head coverings, and it was a video that was shared from another church, how this woman was covering her head where her church didn't, and she was being given a hard time for wearing a head covering. And I listened to a little bit of it and said, okay, folks, this doesn't relate to us. It does and it doesn't. But the comments from the brothers were so backwards and so, I almost felt like they were cavemen. And I tried to make a couple of comments. Margaret, did you see it? Jessica, I don't know if Jessica or Margaret, whether either of you would have seen the comment.
I don't remember seeing that, no.
But it's actually been taken down. But I said in several points, trying to get this brother to address why, if women are covered, and I'm someone who, I don't mind covering my head, but why are we have to remain silent? That's not what scripture is teaching. It teaches two different things. That if you pray and prophesy, you're to cover your head. And it doesn't say that you have to be covered and silent. So why do we do this? And no one would address it. And then I tried to go back to see if anybody had addressed it. And of course, the thread's gone. But Sarah, that's something that, we all have to take these two things separately. And I think most of our meetings don't realize that the verses aren't together, that the concepts are not together in one verse. And I have said so many times over the years to certain people, my father-in-law, in fact, actually, no, it was my stepdad. It wasn't my father-in-law. He said, just wear the stupid hat. I was like, do you not understand? It's not the hat. It's not wearing a hat. It's not wearing a head covering. That's not a problem. It's the complete lack of respect that some brothers have for women that we have a problem with.
Yeah.
And I've been lucky that the meeting I belong to, the last couple meetings I belong to, have been respectful of women. We can have our voices heard. We can speak in public, just not on Sunday morning or from Sunday school. We can be part of the discussion. We can be part of the business meetings, but many ecclesias don't allow even that. I don't know if there's very many in Ontario now that don't even let the sisters read during Bible class. That, if you're reading around, that the sisters can't do it. But I know there are meetings. I heard from a decent source that even at Manitoulin, they're having Bible class in somebody's living room, and the women were not allowed to even read during an informal in-home Bible class. Oh,
We're losing you, Sue.
Oh, am I back yet? But anyway, it's the lack of respect,
Okay.
and I wish that more brothers understand.
Just going back to Robert Roberts, for his time, he was very liberal. I mean, in the Ecclesial Guide, women were allowed to vote, and that was the 1880s. Well, that didn't happen in society for decades later. He also, when he toured New Zealand, approved of a sister being on the arranging board and said, when we get sisters like this, we should use them. And as someone else has said with head coverings, he just said it shouldn't be a matter of contention. In other words, it is not worth arguing over. So we've come from I think, a quite liberal place with attitudes to women. And for some reason now, we're going backwards. In some areas, it's becoming more oppressive. Perhaps people are frightened. I don't know, but far cry from Robert Roberts.
Hannah, you have your hand raised.
Hannah has, her hand up.
Yeah, it's what Sue said about it's kind of lack of respect that women or sisters are asked to cover their heads. I also feel it is a bit of suppression when you are being told to do that, and so it's kind of against my conscience to do that. And isn't there a passage somewhere that says if you do something that's against your conscience, it's actually considered sin? So it's not as easy telling somebody, oh, just put the head on. Well, if it's against my conscience, I'm sinning by doing that. That's something that struck me, and I just can't do it anymore. That's I tried it. I grew up with the opinion that I don't have to do it. I did it out of love, and I noticed it's not going to work for me mentally. And now I don't do it anymore. I don't join meetings at the moment where it's necessary because I just can't consciously do it anymore. Yeah.
I also just want to point out that I know it's really easy on whatever side of any issue you're on to pick the extremes and use those as an example of the general way things are done. And I just, I think there's such a spectrum here. There's especially I think in the unamended community, I grew up unamended, or I'm still unamended, and it has always been a matter of conscience in any ecclesia I've been a part of. I've worn one, I've stopped wearing one, I've never felt pressured either way. So there are many people who don't care what you do about a head covering, who still, maintain the traditional view of, male leadership in the ecclesia. So I think you can we all have a variety of perspectives, I think, probably on this issue. Some may be more liberal, quote unquote, in some areas and more conservative in others. But I think it is important to know that, like, yes, things will be abused, and we could probably pick any of our principles that we hold important and come up with examples where they have been used against someone in an unhealthy way. I mean, certainly our very statement of faith has been used that way. So any principle can be used as a weapon. But I just, I think we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater if we have a principle that is true. And I know that's what we're talking about, is whether it is true. But I think just because there are extreme examples on one side or the other, we ultimately, like Sarah said, and like Julie's point has been, we need to see what God says. And then if people are applying these principles incorrectly, there's work to do there for sure.
I was going to say, thank you for that, Jessica. I was going to say about Sarah's point regarding the Brother Robert Roberts and his more liberal position. There was actually this book that I have in the chat box. By the way, I forgot to press send when in the chat box, so it is in the chat box now. Here's one of the books. My husband, Glenn, actually gave this to me. He's doing some talks this summer at one of the Bible schools about the revolutionary message of Jesus. And he got this book, and this is written by a medieval historian. And it's brought out in this book that around up until the medieval time, the churches themselves did have more freedom for women. But it's what, as the Catholic, in fact, the Catholic Church, they had nuns and even the non, what we would consider non Christadelphian situation, had more activity for women. But as time after Martin Luther, there became more of a restriction on women, and believers became more like the world. And then, because Sarah was making the comment that it's been changing, if you think since Robert Roberts till now, as I was mentioning earlier, in the 1960s and 70s, when women were more part of a workforce, there was birth control, there was more activity by women. The churches around us started this word complementarianism, or being complementary, which was brought up by the churches around us. And as Christadelphians, we kind of took that same route and became more and more restrictive. And I think that's why we, and almost we're going that way more and more as women are starting to see maybe there is a different view of this. Anyway.
It looks like people are starting to trickle off. So I just wanted to say there seems to be an appetite for continuing this discussion, but I also know that it's not everyone's cup of tea. So I wanted to, number one, get a little bit of feedback on that. And I know not everyone who's on here is a regular, and some of our regulars aren't here. But if anyone wants to email me, or if you want to speak up here, that's fine, on, is this something that we want to pursue maybe on an every other month basis for a few months? I know that some people may not be interested in this topic at all, so I don't want to say, let's talk about this for the next 6 months. And, but if, I think that we have a group that has established a little bit of a, this is kind of a safe place to discuss these things. And they are things that are, splitting our community, and we need to come to terms with them. And so, yeah, I guess if anyone just wants to maybe email me some feedback. And then what was the other thing I was going to say? Oh, also, if you have questions or things that you felt like were not addressed that you would like to have addressed, or if you felt like you either disagreed strongly with something but didn't feel comfortable speaking up, or if you agreed strongly and want to, I don't know, just whatever thoughts you have, if you want to email me those, I can we can maybe form a little I don't know, a question and answer session at some point in the future. So yeah, Maggie, do you intentionally have your hand up?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
I just wanted just a short answer to I'm sorry, to Hannah, because she was saying it bothers her conscience, and to me, if it's something like if you're keep celebrating a certain time like Christmas, some people have really strong views against it, and some people say this, I can do it, there's nothing wrong with it, that sort of thing. But head covering, I don't think that falls into that category. And even if you sort of think, well, I don't have to, but others really feel strongly that we should, it doesn't hurt to do it for their sake. It's not sinning to do that. It's being loving, I think, to support those that really feel that you should. It's certainly not a sin. And so it's still up to you. But the way I think that you can't say it's a sin to do it. I think it could be that if you're in an ecclesia where people think scripturally, I should do this and this is the right thing to do, then it's as loving Christ-like thing to be able to just to support them, to know that you love them and you care. And even if it's not all the time for you, maybe you can at least sort of make that concession for others.
I agree with you, Margaret. Paul brings that point out when he talks about whether we eat meat offered to idols, which is no longer an issue with us. But I think that point is brought out, that we don't want to put a stumbling block in front of others. And I would agree with what you just said.
Thank you.
I think that's a really good point, Maggie. But there's another part of that to think about. When you just brought up, Alice, a stumbling block, that's really what we have to consider, is if we are doing something that literally puts a stumbling block in someone. In other words, if what we do causes them to leave the truth or causes them to fall, then yes, I totally agree with what both of you are saying. But what we have to consider is, in this particular case, is wearing a hat going to cause another person to not come out to meeting anymore? Is it going to offend them in that sense? And so that's what we have to weigh, because we can really use, you offend me, so I don't want you to do that. And we wield that around and not really using what offense really means. So if we're going to do that, I just think we should think about what it means.
I think love needs to go both ways, doesn't it? It's got to be mutual submission. So I hear what I didn't see who said that. So I just think if it's going one way all the time, that's not really love. If it's always the same person having to give in, well, that's kind of coming to oppression, isn't it? That you have to do this, and if you're not doing it, you're not showing love to me. It's like, well, that cuts both ways. I just love it if as a community we got to somewhere where we could just accept each other's views. And I think there's a verse in Romans 15 that talks about accepting each other in Christ, because Christ has accepted us. If we could just get there and dish out the love both ways.
Yes,
you're right.
I like that. Dish out the love.
Dish it out. That's what we need. We need it. And
it's just a whole issue.
Yeah.
Of submission. And unfortunately, we don't do that very well in our communities, I feel. And I think we really need to have a lesson on that. And I'm not sure we're going to get to that point this side of the kingdom, because of our human natures. I've lived for 83 years, and
Oh, wow.
I
Me
know.
too.
83.
Me too, Alice.
You
Are
look
we the same
awful.
age, Margaret? We won't get on that issue. That's going down a rabbit hole. But anyway, I just wanted to say that it would be wonderful. And that's what I look forward to in the kingdom, that we're going to have peace. We're all going to be on the same page with everybody and with God and Jesus and all the saints of old. And I think that we just have to do the best we can in this life and try to love and serve God and our fellow man and our brothers and sisters. And we do the best we can, and we'll never agree 100% on all these issues.
No, that's right.
But I do agree with you that it does, with some people's personalities, it does seem that it's always one way, you know.
Yes.
And the rest of us sort of submit. But I do think that maybe discussing it quietly with that person might help, as we're told.
Yeah.
Just to let them know how we feel and come to them and, you know, say, well, I'm concerned about this. So tell me your perspective, and be willing to listen. That's all I have to say.
That's very nice, Alice. I really like that. Thank you.
Yeah. We love
Very,
Alice.
very beautiful. So Margaret had her hand up, and she had her hand up physically, and now she has her hand up in the little corner.
I finally found it. One thing I was gonna, thank you, Julie. One thing I was gonna say was that someone mentioned earlier, respect. I think the love and respect on both sides of any question are what's important. That's what Christ did. That's what Paul did. And even though Paul strongly disagreed with several things and several people and came out very strongly telling them not to associate themselves with certain kinds of people, he still respected them, and he told them things in a respectful manner. And the thing that I have observed in the last 5 years in particular is the society that we're living in, particularly in the US and Canada, is a very disrespectful. And it's coming from the top of the countries. The leadership of the countries is breeding that. And I'm not going political, I'm just making a statement. So we're living in because I've noticed it seeping into the brotherhood, that people are getting more and more vocal. In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, people disagreed about things, but they had their Bibles open and they had a frank discussion. Today, I don't care what side you're on of an issue, we have to be, the silence part comes in here. We have to be vocal about, well, I think, who cares what I think? What God thinks and what Christ thinks is what's important. It doesn't matter what Margaret Smith thinks. If I don't have it from thus saith the Lord, then what I think means nothing. So I think we have to keep the love and the respect for each other. And if we don't agree on something, we may strongly disagree about something, but we need to have respect for the person with whom we disagree, because hopefully we're both using the same scriptures to search out our salvation. Because without that scriptures, neither one of us is going to get it. Just like Alice said, until that day when we all have the mind of Christ and the mind of God, we don't know. We're looking through a glass darkly.
What you're saying is love. You know, so we can give way to one another just out of love. It's not going to hurt us. We don't need to be dominated, but we also need to sometimes make concessions for others because it's big for them. It's a big thing for them. So if it's a big thing for them, it's not going to hurt us.
No, and
it depends on what the situation is.
And the stumbling block part is that it may be a stumbling block to either one of us on this issue or any other issue. But if we've got respect and love for each other and know that we're both using the scriptures and not a human viewpoint and a human opinion, that's what's important.
Right.
And we need to be I tell people all the time, if you see me going and I'm about to be hit by a car, either literally or in life, grab me back from the car. I may not be happy that you spoke to me or that you pulled me back from the destruction, but hopefully after reflection, I will be.
Good
Because
point.
love will keep me from doing that. So if I'm forcing my will on someone, I hope that someone shows me that I'm doing that, because that's not what I mean I should be doing, and that's not what I mean to be doing.
I think, Margaret, the principle you're using is esteeming our brother better than ourselves.
Exactly.
That is totally opposite to our world today.
Yes.
We don't esteem others better than ourselves.
Well, it's
Yes.
totally opposite to human nature.
Definitely.
And that's what I was trying to bring out in the class today, that we do need to, that's the whole idea of submit, to esteem someone else better than yourself. And it goes for every believer, not just for women, not just for men. It goes for every believer. And what I was hoping today is to encourage people to look more at God's word and what it says, rather than to just take the position that we've done this for so long, it must be in the scripture. Let's test the scriptures and see if it's true. And that's all I'm doing. So, and we should respect each other in that process, because the other thing is that everybody is at a different level in their faith growth, in their faith journey.
Yes,
and
true.
So somebody might be here and somebody might be there. And so we need to, if somebody is thinking about these things and wondering and questioning, rather than snuffing them out and saying, I don't want to hear it, we should be able to say, hey, I've been there before, or, hey, yeah, that's an interesting point. Let's look at this together and go back to our Bibles and look at it together.
You're here. Thank you, Julie. It was an excellent class.
Thanks.
I've got to go, so I will use my usual. God be with you all till we meet again.
God be
Thank
with
you.
Bye, Margaret.
Sarah, it's great to see you.
I just want to say the ecclesia we belong to now, several of them don't feel that they need to wear a head covering, but there are some that do. And those that do say, that's up to you. You're not offending me. So I think that they're trying to see what is scripturally correct.
Well, that's wonderful.
And that's what we have to do.
Another
agree.
thing someone just said is that we, at least in my experience in the last 2 or 3 years, the phrase, I am offended by whatever it is. We need to stop. We need to stop doing that. Because
Absolutely.
that's not what offense means. It's God who we have to think about, not us.
Well, where it says offended, that's the old English. It means caused to stumble.
Right.
You
and there's a
doing
difference.
something that caused someone to fall, then that's
there's
serious.
a huge difference.
Yes, and it's serious.
And we
hurting my
have the
feelings.
ability to stop ourselves from stumbling. So if we tell someone else that by whatever action that may be that they're doing, it's usually something that we personally don't like.
Yes.
That you're offending me and you're causing me to stumble. Well, I have the ability to stop myself from stumbling to a point. And I think we need to stop letting the world influence us as much as it is. And I pray every day that God will help me overcome what I'm being confronted with from this world. You can't help it. If you're alive and you read the news, you're being confronted. Anyway, bye. Love you all.
Goodbye. We're going to.
Bye.
All right, everyone, I'm
Thank
going to
you.
go ahead and close it. Sister Ethel, are you still there to close with prayer for us?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Our loving Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time that you've given us and the leadership you've given us to have a conversation about a scriptural issue that is controversial, that we need to look at, that we need to look at your word, and that we need to look at how we apply your word, not only to understanding the issue, but dealing with it with our fellow believers. And we pray that you will help us all to not only search the scriptures for answers on this and many other issues, but also to deal with our ecclesias and our brothers and sisters at large and the larger community with love with respect, in a Christ-like spirit, that we will make a positive contribution, that we will be able to, in looking at these things, strengthen our community and not divide it. We pray that you will use us as tools in your service. We ask, and in particular, we thank you for the leadership that's been provided by Jessica and by Julie to help us in these considerations. In Jesus' name we ask this, and we pray for his soon coming. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Julie.
Thank
And
you.
I'll send out the recording when it's ready. And again, feel
Also,
free.
did you catch the things in the chat box, Jessica? Because
It looked like some of it cut off. Can you just email me?
I'll email it to you, because at first I sent it to Ethel. For some reason,
Oh.
Ethel must have sent me a personal
I
message.
did
and then
send you, yes, and thank you.
And then I thought it was
I don't
going
have
to
it twice.
everybody. Technology, I'm not that good at it.
Yeah, if you'll send it to me, I'll send it out.
Great.
All right.
So
Thank you, everyone. Have a good.
I know that I know there's been these classes. This is the first time I've joined. Is this every Saturday, once a month?
It's generally the third. Let's see. I can't remember if it's usually the third or the second Saturday of the month.
Okay, this is the
It
third
changes a little bit, but
Okay.
yes, it's once a month.
Do you have like an email at? Because
I
How do
do,
you announce
yeah.
it? Is it Facebook? Is it?
I have a mailing list. I can add you to it.
Would you?
Yeah, sure.
I wish I'd realized it. I mean, I knew about it, but I wish I'd realized before, because during the pandemic, I've had so little contact with so few people that I'm kicking myself now that I wasn't joining when I could. So
Well, we're glad to have you today.
This has been a great connection for a lot of us. So yeah,
we've had a lot more lockdowns in Ontario than other places. So it's been
Ethel,
hard.
tell Judy hello from me, please.
Yeah, it's a big adjustment. She's being very brave, very positive.
Who's this?
Judy Farrer. You know Bill Farrer, who died recently, very suddenly.
I'm sorry.
And she has a son in Ottawa, and she's lost both parents and her husband within the past 2 years. And she's rebuilding her life here in Ottawa. And she's only been to Ottawa twice to visit. I mean, like, it's really a big change. So
how old will she be? I've never met her.
She just turned 70 yesterday.
That's hard.
She told us after we went to the tulip, she said, "Oh, by the way, today's my birthday."
Happy birthday to you.
So maybe now that she's up here, we might get her involved in this.
So that's why you're all dressed up today.
I'm not dressed up. I've just got my background on from where I was yesterday.
You have pretty colors and your lipstick.
Sue, can you tell me your email address real quick?
Why don't I just, I'll put it in the chat.
Sure.
Yeah. So thank you, Julie, and especially Jessica. I hope you're feeling better soon.
Yeah,
Nobody would ever be able to tell you were under the weather.
I've been having
migraines,
constant cycles of migraines this week. Not only one that was the really bad headache, but I have a lot of, it's called hemiplegia. It's like one-sided kind of paralysis and weakness when I get them.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
And yeah, that's been bugging me all week, but
oh dear,
glad to be here.
Yeah,
All right.
I saw your posts earlier this week. You've been in our prayers.
We'll let you go get some rest. Thanks very
All right, well,
much.
have a good day.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.